Please welcome the amazing Amanda Stewart.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.
So I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much to all of you in Texas for showing up today. I know there's a lot going on, and thank you for making the time to be here. And also thank you to anyone who's watching online. Also, really grateful that you've made some time tonight to join us in this conversation. I just want to start with two disclaimers. The first is I've pre-recorded this presentation to basically circumvent any kind of technical malfunctions. Part of this disclaimer, this presentation is actually rather long. It's 50 minutes. So just kind of prepare yourself mentally for that length of a video. And then the second disclaimer, during the latter part of the presentation, there's a slide where I showcase a lot of female brass players. And I just wanted to say that I'm really sorry I wasn't able to include everybody. Next time I'm going to make everybody smaller so I can fit more people on there. But I am embarrassed to say that I forgot Megumi Kanda and Carol Jarvis. So next time I'm going to edit this slide and make it a lot better. And lastly, I was just going to say, hopefully we have some time here at the end. I don't know, with the timing of the festival, if that will be possible, but I'm going to be here to answer any questions you might have. You may already have, or that you might develop over the course of watching this video presentation. So that's about it. So let's, we're going to start watching this video, and thank you again.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Stewart, and I play trombone with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. Thank you so much for being here today. I just want to start my discussion today to say thank you to the ITF director, Dr. Karen Marston, the ITF staff, the ITF board, and to this year's ITF host, Dr. Dave Begnosh, for inviting me to speak today. I appreciate these good people wishing to do good things for our music world and our trombone community. I've entitled today's discussion as Women, Rights, Equality, Protections, a discussion of statistics, history, and a path forward. This is the overarching summary of what we will be discussing today, but we will take a few pertinent detours here and there. To further break down our discussion today, I have divided it into 3 segments. Why are we having this very talk today? I will cover this very quickly in the next several slides. The next, in general, how did we get here? Other questions we will answer in this segment are, what does history in the US tell us? What do statistics on violence against women tell us? What do statistics on how sexual assault and harassment are viewed and treated tell us? The last segment, what can we do now with what we know? What can we do now with what we've learned today? What can we do to ensure our industry is better, treats women better, and treats everyone better? Many of you know the invitation to have me speak today was brought about by an article that appeared in April in Vulture magazine, written by Sammy Sussman, entitled A Hidden Sexual Assault Scandal at the New York Philharmonic. In it, we all learned about very hard truths and a very real event. It told of violence against women and a complete failure to protect and support women after that violence. It also spoke of complicity and silence and silencing. I was one of the women mentioned and quoted in this article, and it gave a very quick summary of my time playing with the Philharmonic from 2009 to 2011. It was a time when I felt a lot of intense emotions, like anger, fear, despair, betrayal, grief. The quote by the Black journalist, anti-lynching activist, and suffragette Ida B. Wells on the left, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them, which is basically what the article did. And now, hopefully, we can all talk more openly about these issues. So, as you have already assumed, we are going to talk about some very heavy topics today. Sexual assault, sexism, sexual harassment, racism, and gender discrimination. These statistics are going to be centered around the United States, partly because of time, and partly because that's the country in which I reside. However, the vast majority of these statistics are going to be very similar in other countries. I would encourage anyone to research for themselves the sexual violence statistics in your home country. The first uncomfortable truth we have to face is just how commonplace violence is against women in our country. I'm going to list some very real, very stark statistics that illustrate this reality. I've taken most of these from www.rainn.org, that website. That organization is known as the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. Most of RAIN's data comes from reports gathered by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics. RAIN also updates their statistics to show a 5-year rolling average. Here are the statistics. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. So this is a very serious and ever-present problem for our society. 1 out of every 6 women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. 1 out of every 33 men has also been a victim of an attempted or completed rape in his lifetime. So this is not just a problem for women. Men and boys are also victims of sexual violence. It's a problem for everyone. But the majority of victims tend to be women. This next statistic will show that. 9 out of 10 rape victims are female. Transgender students are at a higher risk of sexual violence. 21% of transgender, genderqueer, non-conforming college students have been sexually assaulted, compared to 18% of non-TGQN females and 4% of non-TGQN males. Native Americans are at the greatest risk of sexual violence. They are twice as likely to experience sexual assault compared to all races. The majority of sexual assault victims are under the age of 30, with 54% being between the ages of 18 to 34 and 15% being between the ages of 12 to 17. 8 out of 10, 80% of rapes are committed by someone known to the victim, an acquaintance, or a former or current intimate partner. The only exception for this is for Native Americans, where 41% of rapes are committed by a stranger and 59% are committed by someone known to the victim. Lasting effects of sexual violence: post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, recurring flashbacks, self-harm, sexually transmitted infections, pregnancy, substance abuse, eating disorders, disassociation, panic attacks, sleeping disorders, and even suicide. College-age victims of sexual violence often do not report to law enforcement, with only 20% of female victims reporting. That means that 80% go under the radar. Out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, only 310 are reported to police. That means 2 out of 3 sexual assaults go unreported, or 66%. Only 50 perpetrators of that 1,000 are arrested, 28 convicted, and only 25 perpetrators are incarcerated. To think of that statistic slightly differently, 975 perpetrators out of 1,000 of sexual assault go free. I also found this really interesting. Of 1,000 robberies, only 619 are reported to police. So that's 2 out of 3 are reported, 33% higher than for sexual assault. 167 lead to arrest, 22 lead to conviction, and only 20 robbers go to jail. These statistics leave a big question mark in my mind. What exactly is going on with our criminal justice system? That will have to be a research project for another day. Also, these particular statistics make me question one more thing. With a very similar conviction rate, why is it that when a woman comes forward to say she's been raped, we don't believe her? But when someone comes forward to say they've been robbed, we believe them. This brings me to the next statistic: false allegations. The research rate of false rape allegations sits somewhere between 2 to 8%. This is roughly the same range for false reporting of other crimes as well. When I think of this particular statistic, I like to use the analogy of two airplanes. You're getting ready to take a trip, and you can choose between two planes. If you take plane A, you have a 92% chance of safely landing and not dying. If you take plane B, you only have an 8% chance of safely landing and not dying. Choosing plane A is like choosing to believe a rape victim. Now we are going to go from present day statistics back into the US's past history to help us answer the question, how did we get here? Are there cultural, societal, or historical norms that have promoted or allowed violence against women? The answer is yes. At the founding of the US, white women had little rights. And I say white women because Black and Native women had zero rights. A Black enslaved woman did not even own her own children, but they were often sold in slave transactions for a few dollars and some farm animals. In 1662, a law in Virginia made children of enslaved mothers slaves, regardless of the father's race or status, so that rape by a white slave master couldn't create a free child. As you can see, before 1776, there were already many slave codes in place that reduced Black people in the eyes of the law to no more than an animal, property, to be used, abused, and sold. Of the signers of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, 40 of the 56 were slave owners. And in the U.S. Constitution, signed in 1787, a Black person was only counted as 3/5 of a free person, a white person. The laws for white women were based around an old English law system that dated back to the 700s to 900s of Norman and Viking law. These were called laws of coverture. Catherine Algor, professor of history at the University of California in Riverside, writes, quote, "Coverture is a long-standing legal practice that is part of our colonial heritage. Coverture is based in English law. Coverture held that no female person had a legal identity. At birth, a female baby was covered by her father's identity, and then when she married, by her husband's. The husband and wife became one, and that one was the husband. As a symbol of this subsuming identity, women took the last name of their husbands. They were femme coverts, covered women. Because they did not legally exist, married women could not make contracts or be sued, so they could not own or work in businesses. Married women owned nothing, not even the clothes on their back. They had no rights to their children, so that if a wife divorced or left a husband, she would not see her children again. Married women had no rights to their bodies. That meant not only would a husband have a claim to any wages generated by his wife's labor or by the fruits of her body, her children, but he also had an absolute right to sexual access. Within marriage, a wife's consent was implied, so under the law, all sex-related activity, including rape, was legitimate. His total mastery of this fellow human being stopped short, but just short of death. Of course, a man wasn't allowed to beat his wife to death, but he could beat her. End quote. This way of treating women in the US was very similar in other nations as well. You'll see similar laws of this time period in Asia and Europe as well. As you can surmise, white men held all the power in the US, from land ownership to voting rights to political power to economic freedom to educational opportunities. The white male was the only power broker and decision maker in the United States. From the beginning, women wanted change. In writings of Abigail Adams to John Adams, we see her advocating for an abandonment of the old laws of coverture and ensuring the right to vote. Sadly, despite John bringing up these concerns in Philadelphia in 1776, nothing was done. I wanted to spend a little time focusing on the founding of the US to showcase the problems that were present then. Now we're going to talk about events that lead us up into the present day, with an occasional detour. Unfortunately, there are some events that I'm going to leave out just simply because I don't have time. We will quickly go through that timeline of, quote, progress in the US, which is so often one step forward and two steps back. But despite the fact we are spending a small amount of time going through this, notice just how long it takes for better laws to be passed and how close to our present day some of these passages were. Also of note, we all know that just because a law has been passed, it does not mean the culture has changed or that people will abide by those laws. Our discussion so far has covered early America, the founding of the United States in 1776 and the writing of the US Constitution in 1787. The next group of dates I want to discuss is referred to as the removal era, from 1820 to 1850. In 1819, the US government promised the Cherokee Nation their land would never be taken from them and would be off limits to white settlers. However, as the United States grew in population, the federal government sought to make room for Western expansion for white people by removing Native Americans from Indian country and moving them west beyond the Mississippi River. In 1830, just 11 years after 1819, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which displaced thousands of Native Americans from their homes and lands. The most infamous displacement is of the Cherokee, whose march west resulted in the deaths of over 4,000 tribal members. This death march was later called the Trail of Tears. I'm going to momentarily skip the next timeline point to draw your attention to the looming Civil War, which begins soon after our next stop in 1848. Our first historical detour will be 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention. The first big start to the women's rights movement happened 72 years after the founding of the United States. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention was the very first women's rights convention to be held in the United States. It was attended mostly by women, but there were men supporters as well. The only Black person allowed to attend was Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery and went on to become a social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. At this convention, a document that was written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and entitled The Declaration of Sentiments began similarly like the Declaration of Independence, with one noticeable change. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." End quote. This document then listed 19 abuses and usurpations inflicted on women by men. These included issues like being denied the right to vote, having to submit to laws to which they did not consent, being denied an education, having inferior roles in church, being prevented from owning property, not owning their wages from work, unequal rights when divorcing. Later on, the convention adopted 11 resolutions, the ninth of which was concerning the right to vote. Other now famous women during this time who were part of the movement, were Lucretia Mott, who's there pictured in the center, and Susan B. Anthony, who's pictured up in the far right corner. Below her is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and to the left of those two women is Frederick Douglass. Despite many of these white women standing for pro-abolition and emancipation, there was still racism at play in the lack of interaction with Black women. Black women were barred from attending the conventions of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. To quote from an article by Dr. Megan Bailey, quote, "Black women found themselves pulled in two directions. Black men wanted their support in fighting racial discrimination and prejudice, while white women wanted them to help change the inferior status of women in American society. Both groups ignored the unique challenges that African American women faced. Black reformers like Mary Church Terrell, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth understood that both their race and their sex affected their rights and opportunities. End quote. In 1896, Black women formed the National Association of Colored Women, spearheaded by Mary Church Terrell. Also of note that same year, 1896, the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson supported Jim Crow laws as long as segregated facilities were, quote, separate but equal. But it wouldn't be until 1954, in the case Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court would finally rule the obvious reality that separate facilities were never equal. For all the work, effort, and protesting all the women in support of men did, progress was slow because their efforts were resisted. Women were jailed, beaten, ridiculed, slandered. Here you see some posters to paint women who just want the right to vote as deserving of jail. And this picture on the left is one of the women arrested in November of 1917 after protesting in front of the White House. In that instance, the women were not just arrested, but brutally beaten by police. Now we will return to our timeline. We've already discussed the Civil War briefly. The Civil War began in 1861 and ended in April of 1865. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. And then on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery, but the Civil War was 3 months from ending. Despite the Civil War officially ending in April of 1865, the state of Texas did not declare slavery over until June 19th, 1865, 2 months later. So remember, slavery remained legal from the colonial settlement of Jamestown in 1619 until the end of the Civil War in 1865. That's roughly 246 years, or 12 generations of people who lived and accepted in some fashion slavery and racism as commonplace. Next on the timeline, the 14th Amendment. It was ratified in 1868 and extended liberties and rights granted by the Bill of Rights to formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, granting African American men the right to vote. Other advancements for African Americans were also made while federal armies remained in the South after the end of the Civil War. However, after those armies left the South and the years of Reconstruction ended, many of these advancements were reversed. Violence and oppression against Black Americans was far from over, because next began the era of Jim Crow laws. Now we will take our next historical detour. These laws started in the South and then spread everywhere in the country. From the end of the Civil War until 1964, almost 100 years later, these laws forced Black Americans to live as second-class citizens and legalized racial segregation and discrimination. Racism was legalized. These laws were meant to marginalize and oppress Black Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, build wealth, own real estate, and also barred them from many other opportunities. Those who tried to defy these laws were arrested, fined, imprisoned, and met with violence and even death. Besides the justice and legislative systems being an enforcer of racism, groups like the KKK rained down terror on Black communities. The KKK started as a private club for Confederate veterans and grew to become a secret society that swept through the South, bringing violence and death. It included members from the most powerful, politically connected white men to the criminal underbelly. Like I said earlier, despite laws being passed like the 14th and 15th Amendments, if people still view others as less than human or simply less in value than themselves, they will find a way to continue to oppress and suppress and even murder others. Now we are going to go back to women's rights in this timeline, as all of this is happening simultaneously. By 1900, every state has passed a law finally granting married women some control over their property and their earnings. In 1916, Margaret Sanger establishes the first birth control clinic in the US. She will be arrested for doing so. In 1918, in the case New York versus Margaret Sanger, Sanger wins the suit to allow doctors to discuss birth control with their married patients. And finally, in 1920, 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, women are finally granted the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. In 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre occurs, where over 300 Black Americans were murdered by white terrorists. In 1924, the Snyder Act, also known as the Indian Citizenship Act, admitted Native Americans born in the U.S. to full U.S. citizenship. Despite the 15th Amendment passed in 1870 granting all U.S. citizens the right to vote regardless of race, it wasn't until the Snyder Act that Native Americans could practice the rights granted by this amendment. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act is passed and establishes a minimum wage without regard to sex. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act is passed by Congress and promises equitable wages for the same work, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex of the worker. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act contains provisions that forbid discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. It took almost 100 years from the onset of Jim Crow laws to finally break the legality of racism, and before that, it was 246 years of slavery. That's over 346 years of oppression for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this country. The 1960s through 80s, women's liberation movement, supporting anti-rape and feminist ideals. In 1969, California adopts the nation's first no-fault divorce law, allowing divorce by mutual consent. 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendments prohibits sex discrimination in all aspects of education programs that receive federal support. 1972, in the case Eisenstadt versus Baird, the Supreme Court rules that the right to privacy encompasses an unmarried person's right to use contraceptives. 1973, in the case Roe versus Wade, the U.S. Supreme Court declares that the Constitution protects women's rights to terminate an early pregnancy, thus making abortion legal in the United States. In 1974, housing discrimination on the basis of sex and credit discrimination against women are outlawed by Congress. In 1975, the case Taylor versus Louisiana denies states the right to exclude women from juries. In 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act bans employment discrimination against pregnant women. And in 1981, the case Kirschberg versus Feenstra overturned state laws designating a husband head and master with unilateral control of property owned jointly with his wife. In 1993, Harris versus Forklift Systems Incorporated, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that the victim did not need to show that she suffered physical or serious psychological injury as a result of sexual harassment, changing the standard of sexual harassment cases in court. Finally, in 1993, marital rape became a crime in at least one section of the sexual offense codes in all 50 states. It took nearly all of 217 years to finally outlaw marital rape in the U.S. 1994, the Violence Against Women Act funds service for victims of rape and domestic violence, allows women to seek civil rights remedies for gender-related crimes, provides training to increase police and court officials' sensitivity, and a national 24-hour hotline for battered women. The act was spearheaded by then-Senator Joe Biden. In 2005, the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. The reauthorization allocated federal funds to aid victims, provide housing to prevent victims from becoming homeless, ensures victims have access to the justice system, and created intervention programs to assist children who witness domestic violence and to those at risk of domestic violence. Okay, you're happy to know that we have arrived at the final slide of Timeline of Progress. In 2013, Reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act. The new bill extends coverage to women of Native American tribal lands who are attacked by non tribal residents, as well as lesbians and immigrants. In 2016, the Survivors' Bill of Rights amends the federal criminal code to establish statutory rights for sexual assault survivors, including the right to not be prevented from receiving a forensic medical examination and not be charged for an examination, have a sexual assault evidence collection kit be preserved, be notified prior to the destruction of a rape kit, and be informed of these rights and policies. In 2022, Joe Biden signs the Reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act again into law as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. And lastly, 2022 Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. The Supreme Court overturns both Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, determining that the Constitution of the United States does not confer any right to abortion, overturning a precedent established 49 years ago. I present these two pictures as two analogies. We have seen through our study of history that sexism and racism were woven into the fabric of our society from the very beginning. It's an unavoidable reality. This could also be viewed from a building perspective. As our country was being founded, sexism and racism were cornerstones of the culture and laws of that time. Just as a house with a faulty foundation, so too building a culture around injustice and discrimination will cause many problems as the country builds up and grows older. Sexism and racism are cut from the same cloth in that they are both systems that view others as less than, that wish to rank one person over another. In our country and many others, they create a caste-like system where people are ranked in value. And for Black and Indigenous women, they have often been placed on the lowest caste rung. My goal with the history lesson today was to help us answer the question of why are women treated poorly today? Why are women often not believed, not valued, not viewed as capable or intelligent? And eventually, why are women not seen as capable of playing the trombone well? I posit that our history that we've just reviewed and the cultural and societal norms born of that history are why these negative things are still happening today, why the statistics on violence against women are what they are, and why these sexist and racist lies continue to be believed and passed on to a new generation. Now I wanted to give you a personal example of my own internalized sexism. When I was in college, I took a plane ride to a music festival. I think it was Music Academy of the West, and that picture is from me playing in a brass quintet there. Okay, so back to the plane ride. I remember putting my trombone in the overhead, getting seated, and buckling up. Then, as everyone else boarded and was seated, the flight attendant ran through the safety checks, after which we had a quick message from the captain of the flight. The message began, "Hi, I'm your captain today." And before the sentence was finished, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die today. Now, why did I have this very random and very quick thought? Solely because the captain happened to be a woman. I didn't listen to the rest of the captain's message because I was in shock that I actually had that instinctual response to a pilot who happened to be a woman. You see, I was raised to believe that I could do anything as a girl, as a young woman. I ran up against the occasional boy who would say, "You can't do that, you're a girl." And I would always respond with, "Watch me." My parents always told me I could do anything I wanted and backed their words up with endless support. So I strongly believed women were as capable, as intelligent, as able as any man. Yet, I had this instinctual view lodged inside of me that it was risky business for a woman to be a pilot. Needless to say, I did not die on that flight that day. But the thought that I was immune to sexist and racist thoughts did die that day. We all have homework to do in this area. We need to dig deep and check ourselves to see what we are holding on to at that instinctual base level. Do we actually hold some racist, some sexist views? I would venture to say for most of us that we in fact do. We also have to understand that our beliefs and instincts are influenced by more than our parents' views, but also by our extended family, by our friends, by our church or synagogue or mosque or temple, by our schools. But let's think outside of those spheres as well. There are countless studies that point to the great power of media to influence a culture's belief systems and norms. Think of the influence of newspapers and radio broadcasts, and then television shows and movies. These shape people from childhood into adulthood. So just because our parents may not have modeled or espoused racist or sexist views, that does not mean that we have never been impacted by our society's sexist or racist views. Today, we have seen in US history that our laws and our leaders have created and supported sexism and racism, and then our families, our houses of worship, our schools, our media content reinforce them. That is why today we must actively reveal these covert beliefs and work to confront and unlearn them. So, in our trombone community and our music community at large, the myth that women can't be great musicians, conductors, composers, trombonists, brass players has been in our industry from the very beginning. Women were not initially allowed in orchestras and bands. Women were not often hired for higher education either. This, of course, was a result of sexism being part of the fabric of our society, as we have discussed earlier. Women were basically not in orchestras until the 1960s, and many orchestras are now 30 to 50% women. However, the brass sections and conductors tend to be the holdouts in gender equality in orchestras. Also of note, women were not allowed to even audition for the Vienna Philharmonic until 1997. Women are, in fact, just as capable, just as talented, just as gifted in music as men are, in composition, in conducting, in brass playing. Let me state clearly, those who think otherwise believe a lie. In our particular slice of the music industry, the myths have been women are too weak to play brass instruments, too fragile, too small. I have actually had all of these lies told to me with a straight face by a man at different points of my career. And my response to them has been, watch me. So often these lies and myths have a way of self-perpetuating. For example, let's start with women are not allowed in orchestras. Then, people never see women playing in orchestras. So, people think that must mean women don't possess the skill to play in orchestras. If they do see a woman who is great at an instrument, they have to explain it away somehow because they've been told women can't do this. The only way to counter this is to face confirmation bias head on, and for so long, most people didn't bother. For the vast majority of time, men have been brass players. Men have been gatekeepers of the brass world, the teachers, the performers, the leaders. The trombone, the tuba, the trumpet, the horn, the euphonium, those were considered men's instruments. They're loud and assertive. But our society wanted women to be submissive, to be quiet, to be nice, to stay in our stations, to be content with where we are. Culture has also suppressed and attempted to keep women from being empowered. These two scenarios act as a self-fulfilling prophecy of the myth. We only see men playing these instruments, so we believe only men are capable of playing these instruments. We believe then women should not play a loud brass instrument. So what happens? Young women and girls don't pick these instruments up in the first place. Recently, I was told of a band director still in 2024 telling young girls they can't play a brass instrument because it's not ladylike enough. They should play something more womanly, like the flute. That's shocking in 2024, but then again, it's really not. Besides some teachers perpetuating this myth, some brass gatekeepers who still teach and hire still sit there secretly believing only men can do this well. Why? Because layers of sexism cause discrimination, and a total lack of self-awareness that they might actually be sexist at the instinctual level. That when they see a woman playing at the same level as a man, they might, without even knowing it, think automatically that the man is better. The man fits the narrative. The man fits the myth. I wanted to mention quotes from the recent past and the present of people who hold the hiring and firing power in orchestras, music directors. These men pictured are still working today. I share these quotes to prove how entrenched sexism is in our culture and our industry even today. One conductor said, quote, "I don't like women conductors." Another conductor said, "The essence of the conductor's podium is strength. The essence of a woman is weakness." Yet another famous conductor pictured here said, "A woman's life in an orchestra is not as long as a man's. She is just not as good at 60 as a man is at 60. And this same conductor also said, "I just don't think women should be in an orchestra." And our last conductor quote of the day is, "Women conductors are just not my cup of tea." With men like this in charge, progress will be halted. With audition protocol changes and the use of screens, more women have been hired in orchestras. However, once the screen comes down for the section playing round, or a trial week, or for that matter, a tenure process, the biased beliefs will reappear. A commitment to anti discrimination education and enforcement of such have helped make the hiring process better, but we all need to remain vigilant. Now, these myths have taken a real beating over the last several decades. With women like Susan Slaughter, Marie Speziali, Abby Conant, Rebecca Sherian, Ava Ordman, Deborah Taylor, Heather Buckman, Jeannie Little, Julie Landsman, Gail Williams, Velvet Brown, and more recently Carol Jansch and Jen Montone, among many others, breaking through the brass ceiling and standing in contrast to the myth. Living, breathing proof of actual reality. That women are, in fact, just as capable and just as gifted at playing brass instruments as men. Their fight and their struggles paved the way for younger women to be able to win auditions, land a teaching position, or have a successful freelance career with less struggle than they experienced. We have more work to do, but we have made progress because of these women. Now we have come to the final stage of our discussion today. What do we do with what we have learned today, and how can we make our part of the music industry better and in turn, our world? I think we can all agree being in a society where everyone is treated fairly, equitably, and respectfully is the best case scenario for all, where everyone has a seat at the table and everyone can sit safely at that table. I've thought about a few points that I believe can help us achieve this or at least move us in the right direction. I don't think these are revolutionary, and I would bet that many of us are already doing them. The first point, education, or educate yourself. We are all doing this right now. We are learning and listening. We are opening ourselves up to hear life experiences from others, putting ourselves in another person's shoes. More that we can do after this is read, listen to podcasts, watch documentaries, continue to learn. I highly recommend reading these two books which helped me prepare this presentation. The one on the left, Credible, Why Do We Doubt Accusers and Protect Abusers by Deborah Turkheimer. Deborah is a professor of law at Northwestern. And Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. This one won a Pulitzer. Amazing books. If you're not as into reading, you could also check out these two Netflix specials, Unbelievable and Stamped from the Beginning. Also, these are online resources. The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, where I got most of the statistics. Also, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, hotline.org. Teen Dating Abuse Helpline, loveisrespect.org. The Gender Action Portal, which is a website that has been created by Harvard that looks at different research around gender, and the Sphinx organization. As a white woman, I have to educate myself to understand, to learn what life is like in different bodies: Black, Asian, Indigenous, immigrant, etc. We educate ourselves so we can better accomplish my second point: advocacy and support. We choose to believe women who tell us about abuse, harassment, discrimination, assault, rape. Believing is one of the strongest ways to support a woman who has been the victim of sexual violence or sexism. I wanted to give you a few thoughts on 3 real world examples. The first example is a student comes to you, a teacher, a professor, and shares with you she was raped. Your first step is to show her support and concern. Your very next step is to mandatorily report. Go to your Title IX office immediately and file a report. It is not your job to investigate or ask questions before reporting. Your job is simply to report. I would then advise you to make sure that your student has been connected to your school's counseling services, or at the very least, ensure the Title IX office did this. Then we are back to support because she will need your support. The second example is of a colleague who comes to you and shares she was sexually harassed at work. Again, your first step is to show support, believe her, and then be there if your colleague needs anything. Offer to accompany her to the HR office to report the harassment, and then participate in any investigation that follows. The last example is if you see something happen at work, let's say it's sexual harassment, you can step in to stop the harassment if it's still happening. You can do so by walking in the room, dropping your keys, creating some type of distraction, and then ask the person being harassed if they could help you with something in another room. If you wish to be more direct, approach the situation and say, "This is unacceptable and needs to stop." And then make sure the victim is okay and ask the victim to leave and go to a safe space with you. Then file a report with HR, since you were the witness of harassment, and to bolster an eventual report by the victim if they decide to file one. The last thought on advocacy and support is to hire women, but also people of color and LGBTQ individuals. Invite them to your schools to perform, to speak, to teach. Invite them to sub in your orchestras, to record on your projects, to compose for your conferences. Representation is important because it helps combat the lies and myths of sexism and racism, and also just plain old ignorance. We all benefit when everyone is included. The last point is sacrifice. If the first 2 points are functioning well, this will not be required because other people will be standing with you to support a victim. Nevertheless, be willing to sacrifice, to do the right thing, to support the victim of sexual violence or sexism, or racism, or all of the above at once. You want to be able to sleep at night, to live without regrets. And again, if more people do the right thing by educating, supporting, and advocating, you will not be left alone to sacrifice. When I was at the New York Phil, I was told point blank to stop publicly supporting a victim of sexual violence, and that if I didn't stop, it would negatively impact my tenure decision. I chose to do the right thing despite the cost, despite being alone in that decision to publicly support. Your workplace might be one where sexism and racism are popular even, and standing up might cost you as well. But know that there are other jobs and other workplaces that are less toxic, and that if you are smart, you will also be able to file a complaint with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, against your workplace to help rectify your situation. In the end, doing the right thing is always the right thing to do. Some final thoughts specific to our industry. Find out who the predators and problematic people are. If you have questions about someone, reach out to several female colleagues to find out. They usually have a list or can find out for you. Do not invite these problematic people to your university, conservatory, festival, conference, orchestra, or chamber group. If you are a great trombonist, but a terrible person, you should lose the privilege to interact with young, vulnerable students, and also lose the privilege of being placed on a pedestal by organizations and other professionals. While we are on this topic, if someone is not predatory, but rather emotionally abusive or toxic, the same should apply to them. Do not bring them anywhere near your students. Also, considering the power of social media, I would recommend either unfriending these problematic people or at the very least, do not like or interact with their social media posts. So often, likes and loves on social media can look like our support of the problematic people and their behavior, and can embolden others to act like these problematic people and make them seem untouchable. One more thought. Explain to students proper behavior and model that proper behavior. My rule has been treat people how you want to be treated. Treat people with respect, dignity, and compassion. We have come to the very end of this talk, and I just want to take the time to say thank you. Thank you to you who are and have been listening. I know this was a very long presentation, and I know that we talked about some very difficult issues, but I know that we have emerged better for it. So, once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, Amanda. First, I want to say a big thank you to you on behalf of the International Film Festival. I'm feeling a little emotional, so I'm going to try not to let that show if I can help it. But extremely meaningful presentation today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to bring us to the festival. And I know I speak for so many members of the community when I say that I've been moved by your grace in the last month or so as difficult experiences have come to light. So you're an inspiration to many, and I want to say thank you to you for being here. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. We have some questions online. I'm going to ask a couple of short questions, and then we will have an opportunity, I think, to accept questions from those who are with us live. So this is a question online, if you're okay taking a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Are there things that you have observed men doing or avoiding doing with the intention of being helpful to women colleagues, but that actually were unhelpful or worse? Are there things that actually would be helpful, but that men do not seem to do?
I think sometimes that men decide to stay silent, maybe on social media, maybe in person, because they, one, maybe fear saying the wrong thing, or two, believe that they shouldn't speak because they want to leave room for the women, perhaps. But I would say that I would prefer, and I think a lot of women would prefer the engagement actually to not be silent and to say something basically. And to use it kind of as a learning opportunity. I mean, unfortunately, we're all going to make mistakes. Like I make mistakes. I don't always say the right things, and that's what apologies are for. So, put yourself out there. Stand for what's right. Say it. That has extraordinary power. And even if you don't say it quite right, you can learn and change that. So, I think that's important because so often, women are speaking up, and some men are definitely speaking up, and I'm extremely grateful to all of them. But and then some have chosen not to, and I would encourage, go ahead and speak.
I have another question from our online forum. And this question is in reference to, quote, the pipeline. And that's a word we hear used a lot in that I'm going to give a little bit of my own commentary here that we often hear, hey, it's not our fault that there are no women. There's no women in the pipeline to choose from. So the question is, growing up, what was your experience with the pipeline?
So I started playing when I was very young, and so I didn't have any knowledge of a pipeline or anything. I just picked the trombone because I liked it. But I was also given opportunity to do so, so nobody stood in my way. It was basically like, "What do you want to play?" And I said, "The trombone." And then that was that. So, and I grew up in a small town, so there just weren't a lot of people playing in general. So I just did it because I liked it. So that was my experience kind of with the pipeline. I would say my opinion on that is I think there's truth to that. I think there is truth to the fact that women don't always start initially on the instrument, but I also want to say there's also truth to the fact that sexism is still real. And so I think you have to hold those two things. I don't think it's fully, I don't think it's 100% the pipeline. You know, we've already seen all of my whole historical presentation there, that would show us that that's actually not reality. Even if women did start playing, and you had all these women, back, earlier, it wouldn't have really mattered. And I think, we have countless women who have, like Abby Conant, for instance, her experience was she was the extraordinary trombonist, but then she was met with extraordinary sexism. So, I think it's a nuanced answer about the pipeline.
Great, thank you so much. I think if we could take a second now and any questions in the live audience. Christopher Bill is ready with a microphone so that Amanda will be able to hear you.
What are some microaggressions that women face in the orchestra world that a lot of them may not be aware of?
What are some microaggressions that women may face in an orchestra that men may not be aware of?
Let's see. A lot of times it's little things like I've experienced microaggressions. Well, I would actually venture to say they're more than microaggressions, but from conductors, perhaps. For instance, I've played principal in a lot of different orchestras, and I'm playing principal. And as a principal, you normally try to make eye contact with the conductor. But I've noticed that some conductors like to look at the men either playing second trombone or bass trombone or the principal trumpet player and just completely avoid me, like I didn't exist. So, and that's, within the last 10 years. And so there's these little things that you sense from people that you don't have as much respect from them. Other things, sometimes, I've served on a lot of different committees over my career, and, certain individuals, they like to kind of talk over you or not anticipate that you know what they're talking about already, and they try to explain it to you. I mean, sometimes this is termed mansplaining, perhaps. Little things like that. Yeah, so those are just small things, but we sense them, how we're being treated differently, basically. And it's not always there, but it is sometimes.
Thank you. That's a good pro tip on making eye contact with the conductor too. I'll make sure I do that as well.
And I don't want to do it though.
It depends on the conductor, right?
Yeah.
Another question from the live audience.
A lot of people overlook these indicators of people starting from kids and beginners. When you start realizing that they are steering women away from brass instruments, what is a nice way you can tell them they're making hits?
This question, Amanda, is from a music educator, and this person has observed that sometimes other teachers are maybe steering young kids who are female away from brass instruments. And what can you do to intervene? How can you talk to that person to hopefully facilitate a change?
Just point blank say, this is incorrect. I mean, there's really no other way around it, right? I mean, people should be free to choose whatever instrument that is. I would venture to say, do they tell male students not to play feminine instruments? Like, do they still steer their male students away from playing flute or piccolo or clarinet? Not that those are female instruments, but sometimes our own stereotypes. So I would venture to ask them that. Are you also doing this to your male students? Are you pushing them to play certain instruments. And I would just say, leave it up to the student. Like, this is their choice. This is the voice. This is what voice speaks to them. You know, you might have a male student who the sound of the flute that really speaks to them, or you might have a female student that really wants to play bass drum or really wants to play tuba. You know, it should be left up to the student because, you know, boys and girls can play any of those instruments. So there's no real reason for anybody to prohibit instruments being selected.
How do you stay encouraged to keep going when you just keep finding out more and more bad things? It feels like there's so much work to do with that. It's just so overwhelming. How do you not give up sometimes?
This question, Amanda, is from an undergraduate music education major. And the question is, how do you stay motivated and keep going, even when we learn about very negative things? Sometimes it can feel really overwhelming. So how do you keep looking forward? Which, by the way, you're amazing at looking forward. I'm just going to say.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. You know, I would venture to say you kind of want to approach this from a mental health perspective. So if you're feeling very stressed out by things recently, you might need to take a little break, unfortunately. You know, whether that means take a day off from social media, do something that you love, go for a walk, go to the park, watch a movie, spend time with friends, just to give yourself a little bit of time to kind of process and bring yourself down to a place of feeling grounded. And then, you know, unfortunately, these types of discussions are, it's a lot, you know, but it's also reality. And so you could take a little break, but then, you know, get back in there because it takes all of us to make this better. And so you have a part in making this better. I have a part in making this better, and we'll do it together because there are a lot of people who want change and are going to work for change. And so just stay encouraged that you're not alone and that we're all on the same page here and we're going to do this together.
That is a wonderful message to close on and something that I hope everyone will take from Amanda's presentation today. And I would like to just say another extremely heartfelt thank you to you for being here with us today for your presentation and for being such an inspiration to so many people. I know you're just living your life, but as it turns out, you're doing a really good job with that. So you have become an inspiration to many. So I just want to say thank you. And I'm sure that the live audience also wants to give you another round of applause.